In September of 2006, a company called Federated Department Stores changed the name on a door. That's it. That's all they did technically. They took down the old sign and put up a new one. The store was still there. The building was still there. The same escalators, the same floors, the same merchandise. And yet thousands of people in Chicago showed up to mourn. There were protests on State Street, petitions with hundreds of thousands of signatures, letters to aldermen, radio call-ins that ran for hours. People were not upset about prices or customer service or a policy change. They were upset because a name was gone. The name Marshall Field's, which had existed on that corner for 154 years, had been replaced with Macy's overnight. Now you might think, that's a little dramatic. It's just a store. But that reaction, that grief, is actually the whole story, because it tells you exactly what Americans had in department stores that they don't have anymore. And it tells you exactly what was taken from them, city by city, decade by decade, in the name of efficiency. This video is about American department stores, all of them, the ones that shaped cities, the ones that fed families and employed generations, and became the physical centers of American life for nearly a century. The ones we lost, and the single decision, repeated over and over across the country, that ended all of it. We need to start here, because the word department store has gotten so watered down that most people under 40 think of it as just a slightly bigger version of a mall anchor. A place to buy cologne and bed sheets. Maybe a little dated, maybe a little boring. That is not what a department store was. The American department store, at its peak from roughly 1880 through the 1960s, was the closest thing most American cities had to a town square. It was where you went for practically everything. Clothes for every member of the family. Furniture, appliances, gifts, books, toys, food. In many stores, you could also have lunch, see an art exhibition, book a vacation, get your hair done, or have your child photographed with Santa Claus. These were not incidental features. They were the entire point. The founders of the great department stores, Marshall Field in Chicago, John Wanamaker in Philadelphia, Roland Macy in New York, Joseph Hudson in Detroit, Edward Filene in Boston, understood that they were not just selling goods, they were creating destinations. They were building institutions that people would build their lives around, and they did it in buildings that announced that ambition architecturally. Wanamaker's Grand Depot in Philadelphia was so large and so ornate that when Ulysses Grant attended its opening in 1876, he called it one of the most remarkable things he had ever seen. Hudson's in Detroit opened in 1911 and eventually grew to 2.2 million square feet across 49 floors, the largest department store by floor space in the world at its peak. Marshall Field's on State Street in Chicago installed a Tiffany glass ceiling in 1907, 1.6 million pieces of iridescent glass, not because it helped sell anything, but because it was beautiful and beauty mattered. These stores were making a statement. They were saying, this city is worth something magnificent, and you, the person walking through these doors, are worth something magnificent too. The business model of the great department stores was built on a simple idea that sounds obvious until you realize how rarely it was actually practiced. Treat the customer like a person, not a transaction, and they will come back for the rest of their life. Marshall Field articulated this as, give the lady what she wants. John Wanamaker put it differently. He pioneered the price tag. Before Wanamaker's, prices were negotiated on the spot, which meant that savvy customers got deals and less experienced shoppers got cheated. Wanamaker fixed prices and posted them publicly, which was a radical act of respect. He was saying, the price is the same for everyone. We are not going to take advantage of you because you don't know how to haggle. Wanamaker also invented the money-back guarantee, or at least popularized it. Return the item, no questions asked, full refund. Today that sounds like a basic customer service standard. In the 1870s, it was a revolution. It said, we are so confident in what we sell that we'll take it back if you're not satisfied. We trust you. We believe you. Filene's in Boston went further. Edward Filene created what became known as Filene's Basement, an automatic markdown system where items that didn't sell were reduced in price on a fixed schedule and after a certain number of days, donated to charity. The system was completely transparent. Customers knew exactly how the markdowns worked. It created a game, a treasure hunt, a reason to come back every week and see what had been marked down. Feline's Basement became a Boston institution with a loyalty so fierce that when it finally closed in 2011, people who had shopped there for 50 years wept in the aisles. Hudson's in Detroit built loyalty through sheer scale and quality of service. At its peak, the downtown flagship employed 5,000 people. It trained its sales staff extensively, assigned them to specific departments where they developed genuine expertise, and paid them well enough that they stayed for decades. A customer who bought a suit at Hudson's in 1940 might be helped by the same salesman in 1960, a man who remembered his name, his size, his preferences, his family. That kind of continuity is not a feature you can program into an app. Neiman Marcus in Dallas built its reputation on the opposite end of the market, pure luxury, but the same underlying philosophy. Stanley Marcus, who ran the store for decades after his father co-founded it, was almost pathologically focused on customer service. He trained his staff to tell customers honestly when something didn't suit them, because a customer who trusted your advice was worth infinitely more than a single sale made by flattery. What all of these stores understood, each in their own way, was that loyalty is not earned by a transaction. It's earned by a relationship. And relationships take time, consistency, and genuine care to build. They built those relationships and they kept customers for generations. Not just individual customers, but families. Grandmothers who shopped at Wanamaker's raised daughters who shopped at Wanamaker's, who raised daughters who shopped at Wanamaker's. That's not brand loyalty. That's something closer to love. You can't talk about department stores without talking about what they meant at Christmas. Because Christmas is where the relationship between these stores and their cities becomes most visible, and where what we lost becomes most clear. The Christmas window display is probably the department store tradition that people remember most vividly. Lord & Taylor in New York started doing elaborate Christmas windows in the 1930s, and they became one of the city's defining seasonal rituals. People would walk the length of Fifth Avenue just to see them. Macy's in Herald Square had its famous windows. Marshall Field's on State Street had windows that told complete stories. Fairy tales, winter fables, intricate mechanical scenes with handcrafted figures that stopped foot traffic on one of the busiest commercial streets in America. These windows cost serious money to produce. They generated no direct revenue, and yet every major department store invested in them year after year for decades. Why? Because they understood something about civic life that would later be completely forgotten in the financial engineering of the 1990s and 2000s. A gift to the city is an investment in loyalty that pays dividends for generations. Hudson's in Detroit had a tradition that is almost impossible to imagine a modern retailer attempting. Every Thanksgiving, Hudson's hosted a parade through downtown Detroit, with floats, bands, performers, and a Santa Claus arrival that officially kicked off the Christmas season. The parade was not branded as a marketing exercise. It was presented as a gift to the city, and Detroit received it as a gift. Generations of Detroit families attended the Hudson's Thanksgiving parade, the way families elsewhere might attend a religious ceremony, as an annual act of belonging. Wanamaker's in Philadelphia had the Wanamaker organ, the largest operational pipe organ in the world. Installed in the store's Grand Court in 1911, it had nearly 30,000 pipes. Twice a day, a concert organist performed on it for free for anyone in the store. For over a century, Philadelphians went to Wanamaker's partly to shop and partly to hear the organ. The organ is still there today, still in the building, which is now a Macy's, and it still plays concerts. But the building is Macy's, and the organ has become a curiosity rather than a civic institution. Frango mints at Marshall Field's, the Feline's Basement markdown game, the Neiman Marcus Christmas catalog, which starting in the 1960s became famous for its his and hers fantasy gifts, matching camels, a pair of submarines, a private island, that made Neiman Marcus internationally famous and nationally beloved. Jordan Marsh in Boston had a blueberry muffin recipe that people have been trying to recreate on the internet for 30 years since the store closed. A blueberry muffin. Think about what it means that people are still searching for a blueberry muffin recipe from a department store that closed in 1996. That's the depth of the relationship these stores built. They didn't just sell things. They created memories so specific, so sensory, so tied to place and time and family, that losing the store meant losing access to something that felt like part of your own history. One of the things that made American department stores so important was that they were genuinely local institutions, not chain stores with a local address, but stores that were woven into the specific identity of a specific city. Rich's in Atlanta was not just a store. It was the place where generations of Atlanta families bought their children's first Christmas gift, where brides registered, where the lighting of the great tree on Thanksgiving night was the signal that the holiday season had arrived. Rich's was Atlanta in a way that had nothing to do with marketing or brand strategy. It was Atlanta because it had been there since 1867 and had seen the city through Reconstruction and the Depression and the Civil Rights era and the transformation of the South. Gottschalk's in California's Central Valley, the Bon Marché in Seattle, Maison Blanche in New Orleans, Hecht's in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Lazarus in Columbus, which was headquartered there and employed thousands of people whose families had worked there across multiple generations, Kaufmann's in Pittsburgh, where the flagship store on Fifth Avenue was as much a Pittsburgh landmark as the bridges or the rivers. Each of these stores had its own character, its own traditions, its own relationship with its city, and each city had a corresponding sense of ownership, a feeling that this store, whatever else was true, was theirs. It had been built for them. It understood them. It knew their weather and their tastes and their holidays and their budgets. This is what regional retail actually meant and why its loss was felt so acutely. It wasn't nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. It was the loss of something genuinely specific, a commercial institution that was irreplaceable because it was particular. No national chain, by definition, can be particular to your city. A Macy's in Chicago and a Macy's in Dallas and a Macy's in Seattle are all the same Macy's. A Marshall Field's was only ever in Chicago. A Hudson's was only ever in Detroit. That specificity was the value, and it couldn't survive the conversion. The golden age of the American department store didn't end because people stopped wanting what department stores offered. It ended because of forces that had nothing to do with what customers wanted and everything to do with how the country was being built. The first force was suburbanization. After World War II, the federal government subsidized home construction and highway building in ways that pulled the American middle class out of cities and into suburbs. The great department stores had been built downtown because downtown was where everyone was. By the 1960s, downtown was where fewer and fewer people were. They were in Levittown, in Park Forest, in thousands of subdivisions that had no Marshall Fields, no Hudson's, no Wanamakers nearby. The stores responded by opening suburban branches, and this was the beginning of the end, though nobody knew it at the time. A branch store in a mall is not the same thing as a flagship downtown. It can't be. The flagship is the store where everything is possible, where the full vision of what the institution is gets expressed. The branch is a compromise. It has fewer departments, less staff, smaller spaces, no Tiffany ceiling, no pipe organ, no Thanksgiving parade. And the branch stores, over time, trained a generation of customers to think of department stores as ordinary, because the branch stores were ordinary. The second force was discount retail. Kmart arrived in 1962. Walmart arrived in 1962. Target arrived in 1962. That year saw the founding of all three major discount chains simultaneously, which tells you something about the economic forces that were converging. These stores offered lower prices on basic goods by stripping away everything that made department stores distinctive: the service, the beauty, the experience, the tradition. They were betting that enough customers cared primarily about price to make the stripped-down model work. They were right. The department stores couldn't compete on price without becoming discount stores themselves, which would destroy the very thing that made them worth anything. So they tried to hold the middle ground, better than a discount store, more accessible than a luxury retailer. And that middle ground got narrower and narrower as the decades passed. The third force was specialty retail. The Gap, Pottery Barn, Williams-Sonoma, Bed Bath & Beyond, Circuit City, Sports Authority, starting in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s. Specialty retailers arrived to pick off department stores category by category. You no longer needed to go to Hudson's for electronics, because Circuit City had a bigger electronics section and staff who only knew electronics. You no longer needed to go to Marshall Field's for kitchenware, because Williams-Sonoma had a better kitchenware selection in a more intimate environment. The department store had thrived on being the place that had everything. Category by category, it stopped being that. These forces were real, and the department stores that survived them longest were the ones that leaned hardest into the things that specialty retailers and discount stores couldn't replicate: the experience, the service, the tradition, the sense of civic identity. The ones that survived by cutting those things to reduce costs were only delaying the inevitable, because once you cut the thing that makes you irreplaceable, you're just another store. And there's always a cheaper or more convenient version of just another store. The external competitive pressures would have been manageable. Department stores had weathered hard times before. The Depression nearly killed several of them, and they came back. What proved unsurvivable was what happened when private equity arrived. Through the 1980s, leveraged buyouts became the dominant financial innovation in American business. The basic structure was simple. A firm borrows a large amount of money, uses it to buy a company, then uses the company's own assets and cash flows to pay back the debt. If the company has real estate, you sell the real estate and lease it back. If the company has excess cash, you extract it as dividends. You reduce headcount, close underperforming locations, and cut every cost that isn't immediately essential. Then you either sell the leaner company to someone else or take it public again. Department stores were, on paper, attractive targets for this strategy. They owned valuable real estate. Those flagship downtown buildings sat on land that was worth a fortune. They had strong brand recognition. They had loyal customers. They had cash flows. And they had costs that a financial engineer could identify as excess. All that staff, all those services, all those traditions that generated loyalty but couldn't be valued on a balance sheet. Federated department stores went bankrupt in 1990, weighed down by the debt from its own acquisitions. Macy's went bankrupt in 1992, having been taken private in a leveraged buyout that loaded it with debt it couldn't service. Carter Hawley Hale, which owned Emporium and Broadway stores on the West Coast, went bankrupt. Woodward and Lothrop in Washington went bankrupt. The 1990s were a graveyard for department stores that had been financialized beyond their ability to recover. The bankruptcies created consolidation opportunities. Federated, restructured in bankruptcy, emerged as an aggressive acquirer. It bought Macy's out of bankruptcy in 1994. It bought Broadway stores in 1995. It bought Bon Marché, Lazarus, Goldsmiths, and others. With each acquisition, it applied the same playbook. Convert the acquired chain to either the Macy's or Bloomingdale's brand. Eliminate duplicate functions, reduce costs, extract synergies. The regional stores disappeared into the federated machine one by one. May Department Stores was doing the same thing on a parallel track, acquiring Foley's, Hecht's, Kaufmann's, Lord & Taylor, Filene's, and others, converting them to May's house brands, squeezing out costs. By the early 2000s, the American department store industry that had once consisted of dozens of distinct regional institutions had been consolidated into 2 or 3 massive holding companies, running a handful of national brands. When Federated bought May Department Stores in 2005 for $11 billion, it acquired what remained of almost every great regional department store in America: Marshall Field's, Filene's, Foley's, Hecht's, Kaufmann's. Lord & Taylor was eventually spun off, then later collapsed entirely. Everything else got converted to Macy's. On September 9, 2006, Federated completed the mass conversion. Hundreds of stores across the country woke up that morning with a new name above the door. In Chicago, Marshall Field's became Macy's. In Boston, Filene's became Macy's. In Houston, Foley's became Macy's. In Pittsburgh, Kaufman's became Macy's. In Baltimore, Hecht's became Macy's. In Columbus, Lazarus became Macy's. In Atlanta, Rich's, which had already been renamed by May before Federated even arrived, was already gone. The reasoning was straightforward and, within its own logic, defensible. A single national brand could be advertised nationally, which was far more efficient than maintaining separate advertising campaigns for dozens of regional stores. A unified supply chain was cheaper to operate. A single IT system was cheaper than many regional systems. The math on a spreadsheet worked. What the spreadsheet couldn't model was the reaction. In city after city, the response was the same as Chicago's. Grief, anger, protest, a sense of loss entirely disproportionate to what had changed physically. The stores were still there. The merchandise was largely the same. The prices were similar, but something had been taken, and people felt it immediately and viscerally, even if they struggled to explain exactly what. What had been taken was specificity. For generations, these stores had been theirs, particular to their city, shaped by their city's history and tastes and seasons. Now they were the same as everywhere else. The Marshall Field's that had understood Chicago was gone. In its place was a store that could have been in Miami or Phoenix or any American city. A store that didn't know Chicago because it wasn't from Chicago, because it wasn't from anywhere. The loyalty that had been built over generations did not transfer. Customers who had been Marshall Field's customers for 50 years did not automatically become Macy's customers with the same depth of feeling. Some of them became Macy's customers out of habit and convenience. Some of them went elsewhere. Some of them went online, where the entire premise of a department store, the physical experience, the service, the tradition, was irrelevant. None of them were ever as loyal to Macy's as they had been to Marshall Field's, because loyalty like that isn't transferable. It belongs to the institution that earned it. And when the institution disappears, the loyalty disappears with it. Let's take stock of what actually disappeared. Wanamaker's in Philadelphia closed in 1995. The Grand Court, a breathtaking space with the world's largest pipe organ, still exists inside what is now a Macy's. The organ still plays twice a day. But Wanamaker's, as an institution, as the thing that John Wanamaker built and that his family maintained for a century, is gone. With it went the accumulated knowledge of how to run that specific store in that specific city for that specific community. Hudson's in Detroit closed its downtown flagship in 1983. The building itself was demolished in 1998. A controlled implosion that thousands of Detroiters watched in person, many of them crying. The demolition of the Hudson's building is often cited as a symbol of Detroit's broader decline, which tells you something about what the store meant to the city. A department store building getting demolished doesn't usually make people cry. This one did. Filene's Basement, the separate discount operation that Edward Filene created with its automatic markdown system, outlasted the main store but eventually collapsed in 2011. For the last few days before it closed, people came to the original Boston location and bought things they didn't need just to have something from there. They were buying memories, or trying to. Rich's in Atlanta hosted its last Christmas tree lighting in 2003, after 136 years of the tradition. The tree had moved to a new location, but there was no Rich's anymore to host it. The store had been absorbed into Macy's. The tradition continued in a different form, but the thing that had made the tradition meaningful, its connection to an institution with a century and a half of history in that specific city, was gone. Jordan Marsh in Boston closed in 1996. The blueberry muffins went with it. People have been sharing the recipe online for nearly 30 years, trying to get it right, because the muffins are not really about the muffins. They're about the Jordan Marsh lunch counter and their mother in a Saturday afternoon in 1974. You can't recreate that with flour and butter and blueberries, no matter how close you get to the original recipe. Lazarus in Columbus, Ohio, headquartered there, deeply embedded in the city's commercial and civic life, became Macy's in 2005. The flagship store on High Street, which had anchored downtown Columbus for over a century, is now closed entirely. The building is being redeveloped. The name is gone. The people who worked there for 30 years, who knew the store the way you know a family home, moved on. Their knowledge, specific, accumulated, irreplaceable, dispersed. This is what consolidation actually means at the human level. It doesn't mean stores close immediately. It means knowledge disperses. Traditions become detached from the institutions that gave them meaning. Relationships between a store and a city get severed and replaced by a transactional relationship with a national brand. And eventually, when the national brand struggles, as Macy's has struggled increasingly since 2015, closing hundreds of stores, there is nothing underneath it. No local identity to fall back on. No civic relationship to sustain it through hard times. Just a name, increasingly struggling to justify its existence. Here is the central paradox of the department store story. The qualities that made these stores worth anything, the service, the traditions, the civic relationships, the deep local loyalty, were exactly the qualities that could not be captured in a financial model. And in an era when financial models determined every major business decision, anything that couldn't be captured in a model was treated as if it didn't exist. The cost of producing the Marshall Field's Christmas windows could be calculated precisely. The value of those windows to Marshall Field's relationship with Chicago could not be calculated at all. So the windows were seen as a cost with no corresponding benefit, when in reality they were an investment in something that had been generating returns for decades. Returns in the form of customer loyalty so deep that it lasted generations. The same logic applies to everything that made these stores what they were. The Wanamaker organ cost money to maintain and operate. The Hudson's Thanksgiving Parade cost money to produce. The Feline's Basement automatic markdown system was a complex operation with real costs. The personal shopping services, the restaurant operations, the in-store chocolatiers, all costs, all hard to justify on a quarterly earnings call, all in the financial engineering of the 1980s and 1990s, candidates for elimination. And so they were eliminated, one by one, even before the final conversions happened. The personal shopping staffs were reduced. The restaurants were closed or outsourced. The traditions were maintained in diminished form or dropped entirely. The stores were hollowed out before they were renamed, which meant that by the time the name changed, much of what the name had meant was already gone. There's a business concept sometimes called destroying value while creating profit. It's what happens when you extract cash from an institution in ways that damage the institution's long-term health. Cutting the staff who've worked in the same department for 20 years saves money immediately and costs you the accumulated knowledge and customer relationships they carried. A cost that won't show up for years, and when it does, will be hard to trace back to the original decision. This is how great institutions get hollowed out, not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small decisions that each look rational in isolation and add up to catastrophe. The department stores of America were hollowed out exactly this way over decades. The final conversions to Macy's were not really the cause of their decline. They were the last step in a process that had been underway for 30 years. What the conversions did was remove any remaining possibility of recovery. You can rebuild a diminished Marshall Field's. You cannot rebuild Marshall Field's once it no longer exists. Not every great American department store disappeared. A few survived, and their survival tells you something important about what the successful ones did differently. Nordstrom is the most obvious example. Founded in Seattle in 1901 as a shoe store, Nordstrom expanded into full-line department retail in the 1960s and has remained a genuinely competitive business into the present day. Why? Because Nordstrom built its identity entirely around service. Legendary, almost mythological customer service that generated stories people repeated for decades. The story about Nordstrom accepting a return on a set of tires, despite the fact that Nordstrom has never sold tires, is almost certainly apocryphal. It has been repeated so many times because it captures something true about how Nordstrom was perceived. A store with a reputation for accepting tire returns is a store whose service culture has penetrated deep into the public consciousness. Nordstrom also made a decision that many of its peers did not. It stayed family-controlled. The Nordstrom family remained involved in management for generations. which meant the long-term identity and culture of the store had advocates at the highest level who were invested in more than quarterly earnings. When you're a family that has built something over 4 generations, you think differently about decisions than when you're a hired executive whose compensation is tied to 3-year performance targets. Neiman Marcus survived longer than most, though it ultimately filed for bankruptcy in 2020, crushed by debt from a private equity leveraged buyout. The same story, just delayed. But for most of its history, Neiman Marcus survived by going further upmarket rather than trying to hold the middle ground. It became a genuine luxury retailer with a customer base wealthy enough to be relatively insulated from the price competition that killed middle-market department stores. Bloomingdale's survived as a Macy's subsidiary, partly because it had a distinct enough identity, more fashion-forward, more urban, more upscale than Macy's, to justify its separate existence. Federated, whatever its sins with the regional conversions, understood that Bloomingdale's stood for something specific enough to be worth maintaining. The lesson from the survivors is consistent. Survival required either a genuinely distinct identity maintained with discipline across decades, or family ownership that insulated decision-making from short-term financial pressure, or a customer base wealthy enough to sustain premium pricing. The stores in the middle, serving middle-class customers with decent but not exceptional service and broad but not distinctive merchandise, had no sustainable competitive position once the financial engineering began. Go back to that September morning in 2006. The signs come down in Chicago, Boston, Houston, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Columbus. The same sign goes up everywhere. Macy's. The Federated executives who made that decision were not wrong about the economics. The math did work. The national brand did create efficiencies. The advertising savings were real. The supply chain simplification was real. On a spreadsheet, September 9th, 2006 was a good day. But the spreadsheet couldn't see what Chicago saw, what Boston saw, what every city that lost its department store saw. The end of a relationship. Not the end of a store. A store can be replaced. The end of something that had been built slowly, carefully, over generations, through thousands of small acts of service and generosity and genuine care for the people it served. John Wanamaker built a store where the price was the same for everyone because he thought that was fair. Marshall Field took returns without argument because he respected his customers. Joseph Hudson paid his salespeople well and kept them for decades because he understood that their knowledge and relationships were the store's most valuable asset. Edward Feline created a bargain basement and made it a game because he thought shopping should be fun. These were not marketing strategies. They were beliefs expressed commercially. What replaced them was not a strategy or a belief. It was a calculation. And calculations, however correct, cannot build the things that beliefs can build. They cannot create a tradition that makes families drive from the suburbs every Christmas to look at windows. They cannot create a muffin recipe that people spend 30 years trying to recreate. They cannot make 7-ton bronze clocks into meeting points for a city, or turn a restaurant on the 7th floor into the place where proposals happen and anniversaries are marked and the holidays begin. The American department store was the greatest retail institution this country ever produced. At its best, it was one of the truest expressions of what American commerce could be. Generous, particular, and genuinely invested in the communities it served. We lost it not because customers abandoned it, but because the people who owned it stopped understanding why it mattered. That's the decision that ended it, not the one in 2006 when the signs changed. The decision that ended it was made much earlier, in boardrooms where someone looked at a tradition and saw only a cost, and looked at loyalty and saw only a number, and decided that what couldn't be measured didn't count. The clocks are still on the corners in Chicago. They keep perfect time, but the store they were built for is gone. Thanks for watching Vintage America. If your city had a department store that you remember, whether it's still there or long gone, tell us about it in the comments. These stories deserve to be remembered. We'll see you next time.